Hello, this video is for students who missed Introduction to Wellbeing Week 2, Day 1, where we're beginning to discuss the physical unit. We're starting with the verse in Psalm 139:14. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. This is a week where we really get to consider God's good design of our bodies. Just a few things as we get going. A reminder that this course is not meant to tend to clinical mental health concerns. We, of course, want to advise you to work with professionals if the concerns you have are disruptive or interrupting your life. This course is designed to explore common collegiate challenges to well-being, and we're offering skills and practices that we, if you decide to, could become habits that foster well-being. So we just want to be careful that we're not misapplying, misunderstanding, or misusing this information. Sometimes I think students want to share what they learn, and of course that can be very valuable, but when you take on the stance of an expert for someone who might need or benefit from professional help, that's where we are no longer staying in our lane, as you might say, and we want to make sure that we have appropriate boundaries and use professional help when that would be important. Today we're going to talk about knowledge and self-awareness and common challenges, and then on day 2 of this week we're going to talk about different habits that we could embed to support our well-being. Okay, so why are we learning about stress? You at this point have already done the core lessons. You know we're really focusing in on stress. Stress can be useful and it can also make life challenging. And so we want to spend some time thinking about what could students understand about their body and their stress response so that they can use that knowledge to their advantage. So what I'd encourage you to do is pause the video right now. There is a diagram in your SRB with some questions for notes in the day 1, week 2 section. And I want you to complete that diagram and those notes and then come back. So briefly, I'm just going to cover these very, very quickly. You, of course, can go back to the core lesson if you feel like another review would be useful. So we're talking about the two branches of the central nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. We're talking about the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic nervous system, we have the parachute here because that's where we slow down. The body does things that it needs to do and doesn't need to do when we're in survival mode, but needs to do, rest and digest. Then we have the amygdala. When the amygdala, who is looking out for you, this brain structure who's kind of always on alert, when the amygdala senses a potential threat, it works with the hippocampus. These two structures in the limbic system are conferring to decide if this is an actual threat. If there's no memory, or if there is a memory and it is a memory indicating that this stressor is threatening, or maybe the hippocampus says, well, this hasn't happened to us, but we remember this happening from this social referencing cue. Then the limbic system, or the amygdala and the hippocampus of the limbic system, alert the hypothalamus. And we are referring to the hypothalamus as kind of this control or command central, which then activates the sympathetic nervous system. This is the gas, or the foot on the gas. We're ramping up, getting the body ready to respond to the threat. And then the HPA axis is the secondary, the reinforcement, also alerted or activated by the hypothalamus in order to give us energy, cortisol and adrenaline to keep the body moving. So if you were in class, we would have a conversation about the spectrum of stress, talking specifically about the usefulness of acute stress and the potential consequences of that prolonged chronic stress. So this may be a good time to pause and take some notes. And then I'll just cover this in brief. Again, the acute stress, remember this is quick and immediate. It's tied to a specific stressor, and the body responds with the sympathetic nervous system and the HPA axis activation so that we're mobilizing resources and handling that stressor. Chronic stress is that prolonged experience that isn't necessarily tied to a direct stressor. It's when the body is, isn't turning off the HPA axis. And so we're getting this constant flow of cortisol through the body, which can lead to anxiety, depression, digestive problems, heart disease, sleep problems, and then especially for college students, memory impairment, impaired concentration, and then of course the overproduction of cortisol and adrenaline. So not overly useful, and this is what we are more concerned with when it comes to the negative consequences of stress. But again, stress is not all bad. And as you learned in Dr. McGonigal's video, there are benefits or gifts of stress. Stress increases our resilience. Stress causes brain cells to become more resilient, able to respond to challenges, and strengthens neural networks. Stress releases oxytocin, which helps us seek out social support. It mobilizes energy, and it's redistributing the energy to where it's most needed so that you can respond to that stressor. Stress facilitates memory. A small amount of cortisol helps the hippocampus encode memory, and stress enhances cognitive performance. Small amounts help us respond well. And so now we're going to move into a diagram, and this diagram is on page 28 in your SRB. You can pause the video and take some notes here. This is, I hope, really useful as we're thinking about moving from low arousal to high arousal or activation, and then also considering on the left side of this diagram our performance. So a little bit of stress, right, and a little bit of activation helps to facilitate, right, our performance. A little bit more activation, and we are going to have what we would call optimal performance, right? We have enough movement and energy, or movement of energy in our bodies to respond really well cognitively to whatever we're facing. But then if we continue that activation or that state of arousal and it's becoming higher and higher, mobilization and degradation can start to create an atmosphere where we're not performing as well. We start to lose focus and have a more challenging time working on whatever it is that we're working. So now it's requiring constant mental effort to stay engaged. And sometimes we notice that our performance is just really suffering because we've experienced too much stress for too long. So stress can be really useful. It can provide the drive and stamina we need at a certain amount, right? So we have focused attention and access to memory and learning. And then over time, or with an increased amount of stress, that can become detrimental. And so what we're asking you to consider as college students is, when can you be aware of what is optimal? And when do you notice that your performance is starting to suffer? And that is where we're going to focus on intervention. And we'll give you some interventions in our next class. But part of our encouragement to you is to grow in your self-awareness so that you can be thoughtful and strategic about when you intervene. Too much cortisol, right? And this kind of goes back to this diagram. When stress is becoming detrimental, the HPA axis uses all of the glucose and there's little energy left for the thinking parts of the brain. This idea is going to come back next week when we're thinking about how can we do our best thinking if our body is in a state of hyper arousal when it comes to our activation of our stress response. It can result in diminished executive functioning, logic and reasoning, impulse control, sequence, and goal-directed behavior. Our memory can be suppressed. Our memory and our ability to recall becomes more difficult because the hippocampus structure is actually changing and becoming smaller, and the amygdala is taking over, constantly firing and telling the brain things are in trouble, right? And we need to protect ourselves. So then we're experiencing more frequent and higher experiences of the stress activation. We would have you jump into small groups at this point, thinking about, and I would encourage you to pause here, what does optimal performance look like for college students? What might students notice about themselves, and what might others notice about themselves when they're experiencing kind of this, like a good sweet spot amount of stress and activation? And then on the other side, what would too high, as we're moving, to mobilization, where it's taking a lot more energy to stay engaged, or you're starting to notice the influence of your stress on your work and you're not able to perform as well. What might students notice about themselves, and what might others notice? Again, this is all about creating self-awareness. What indicators might college students use to know when intervention could be helpful? Now, when you're doing this practice, some of these indicators might be unique to you, but we just want you to expand your thinking around what this could look like. Christine Carter writes that depression and anxiety usually originate with what research called a dysregulated stress response. This means that parts of the brain that signal threats, the limbic system, specifically the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the hypothalamus, become hyperactive, making people feel bombarded with worrying thoughts and anxious feelings. Anxiety can balloon in young adults so that they have larger and larger stress responses to smaller and smaller stimuli. Right, this goes back to the diagram that we just looked at. When we experience an amygdala that is responding over and over and over to stressors that maybe we're smaller, right? But our stress response is activated over and over and over, and those we'll talk next week about the neural networks in our brain are getting stronger, and we are responding with more a higher sense of arousal or activation of our stress response to smaller and smaller stimuli. And so one of the questions that we want to ask is, what are some of these smaller stimuli that seem to trigger bigger stress responses? And again, remembering that this is brought on by a dysregulated stress response. So slowing down and recognizing the activation of the stress response and the production of cortisol is important. And we need to think about, what does it mean to slow down? And that's what we'll do later in this week. So briefly, I want to address the mind-body connection. The body, we're noticing how that can affect our mind, right? When our stress response is activated, that's certainly going to influence our thoughts and our emotions. The body can affect the mind. Right here, I don't want to be overly redundant. Physical stress response is chronically activated. When we have chronic stress, right, the body can impact different parts of the brain, thus impacting our cognition, our ability to pay attention, to encode memory, and to make decisions. Additionally, the mind can affect the body, right? We can think our way into activating the physical stress response. Think about horror movies or gaming, virtual reality, social media, right? What we're thinking, what we're perceiving as a threat may not be, but it could activate our physical stress response. And thus we want the mind-body connection to be something that we're aware of because of how it affects our well-being. So the physical unit is asking you to begin to think systemically, thinking about how seemingly disconnected variables influence one another, right? My stress response might influence how I show up with other people. And then recognizing that when I'm engaged with other people or other organizations, that might also influence my experience of stress. And then in class, we're doing an activity where we're asking students to think about examples of how a system may affect an individual's stress and how might the stress influence the individual at the relational level. When God's people, what can God's people do to renew or bring about renewal and bring shalom? We encourage you to think about variables at each of these levels, the intra, the inter, and the systems levels of well-being. Okay, we're learning this because we want to give you knowledge that empowers agency. If you know the difference between When you need a little bit of stress and when you need to mitigate that stress, you can use your agency to figure out how you want to influence your own intrapersonal well-being.